This week, households in Sweden received a government pamphlet entitled In Case of Crisis or War. It suggests practical preparations for those eventualities and offers advice on what to do if either occurs. This edition of In Case of Crisis or War is much thicker than its predecessor. Similar manuals have also recently been published or updated in print and online by the governments of Finland, Norway and Denmark. The peoples of the Nordic nations are famously unflappable folk. If they're this worried, how worried should the rest of us be? Europe faces gathering storms on several fronts. Russia is on the march in Ukraine, if slowly and at terrible cost. This week, Russia launched what it claimed was a new mid-range hypersonic ballistic missile at Dnipro, threatened to do similar to Ukraine's allies, and ostentatiously lowered its threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. In 8 weeks, give or take, the United States will swear back in President Donald Trump, whose attitude to Europe is a combination of contempt and indifference, and whose opinions of Russian President Vladimir Putin have long been rather more favourable. Europe should be able to look after itself, and President Trump was not wrong during his first term to suggest as much. It is unclear, however, whether Europe's citizens, militaries and leaders are ready, should they have to. Has Europe properly absorbed any of the many recent hints that it might one day be on its own? What still needs to be done? And what happens if it isn't done? This is the Foreign Desk.
I think in Finland they've taken it seriously for a much longer period of time. In Sweden they are ramping up that seriousness. In Norway there's still a feeling that surely it can't happen to us.
With the right leadership, Europe could defend itself, but it's going to take time. This is not going to happen overnight, and we've got to start now. We should have started years ago.
It's right there on page 188 of Project 2025. The main mission of the Trump administration is to pick Europe apart and to look for new allies.
Welcome to the Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined first of all from Monocle's Norway desk by Gunnar Gronlid. Gunnar, welcome to the show, and you have brought with you some literature which very much pertains to the theme of this week's episode. What do we have here in front of us?
Indeed I have. So, in the preparedness for the Nordics against potential war, particularly with Russia, the Nordic countries have all sent out brochures to their population to prepare them in case of emergencies or war. And I've brought two in particular, the Swedish one and the Norwegian one, because they have some very interesting differences that I think say a lot about what's going on in the Scandies at the moment.
Well, let's start with the Norwegian one, because Norway has always taken this stuff very, very seriously. As is often forgotten, Norway does have a land border with Russia right up there in the far north. Norway was a founder member of Nato. So when Norway's government tells its people, such as yourself, to prepare for the worst, what do they tell you to do?
Well, what's interesting about this is that the actual content of the brochure is not all that intense. I can read the title here. It simply says how you can play your part in Norway's emergency preparedness. It almost reads like the kind of employer manual that you would get in a new job. Even the graphic design, to be honest, is very reminiscent of the kind of thing that I would get working in a convenience store in Norway.
It is very calm and neutral and matter of fact.
Very calm and neutral. If you start to sort of read some of the sections here, it might say, we need water for drinking, food preparation and hygiene. And if you store on 20, etc., etc., it is sort of very matter of fact. And this is sort of the strategy that they've gone with. The Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection, one of their spokespeople said very specifically that we don't really want to go into the why or any particular messaging. We just want to be very practical. Here's what you do in these situations. I think the downside of that is that when you read it, it doesn't exactly inspire a lot of action. It doesn't exactly inspire a lot of urgency. Everything from the design of this to the actual content sort of lulls you into, yes, you should know about this stuff. Here's how you prepare for if you need to have water for 7 days in case of an emergency. But it doesn't give that sense of urgency that this is something that might actually happen in the near future.
But is that not in keeping with a certain national character? I have not spent a great deal of time in Norway, but there is, of course, a stereotype that attaches to your fellow Norwegians and indeed to most people of the Nordics that you are, by and large, a fairly unpanicky, unflappable, not kind of melodramatic bunch of people who would rather just deal with practicalities than possibilities.
I completely agree. It's sort of like the German mentality, but even calmer. Maybe it's because of the cold. It just slows us down.
But that said, and you did foreshadow that there is quite a leap in tone from the Norwegian brochure and the Swedish brochure, because the Swedish one does have a little bit more of that hair on fire, we're all doomed tone to it.
Absolutely. So the Swedish brochure is called In Case of Crisis or War. It is being distributed to every single household in Sweden, and everything from just the first page, what you see is a very nicely designed illustration, a woman at the front.
Nicely designed is the least you hope for from the Swedes, obviously.
With military garb, a gun, families being protected by the military. And as soon as you jump into this, it really almost reads more like the kind of speeches that you'd get out of Churchill, or even something that you'd hear Zelensky say. As you get in here, one of the things that immediately jump out, it's highlighted in this nice yellow shade. If Sweden is attacked, we will never surrender. Any suggestion to the contrary is false. And throughout this entire thing, there's a much bigger focus on the potentiality of war, and very explicitly saying the geopolitical situation is tensing up, the whole world is getting more uncertain. War with Sweden becoming attacked by a foreign adversary is a very real possibility, and we as a nation have to be prepared for it. You might have to serve, you might have to go to war. Even if you're up to 70 years old, it says, you might still have to serve in the military. It's a totally different message that, again, in the opposite direction from the Norwegian strategy, it tells you the why, and it sort of integrates all of this. Everything it says about, preparing with water, food, and all of that is in the context of we might actually be attacked, and you really need to do this stuff.
Do you think there's possibly an amount of overcompensating going on here from the Swedish government? Because obviously, as we were saying, Norway, your country, has been a member of Nato from the off, has always taken this stuff very seriously. Finland, though not a member of Nato until very recently, has always taken this stuff incredibly seriously. Whereas Sweden, which I don't think has been in any sort of meaningful conflict since there was a bit of a punch-up with the Norwegians several centuries ago, during which I think a few roof tiles were dislodged, has mostly just sat every conflict out.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, Sweden joining NATO basically ended around 200 years of military non-alignment. And you can even see Sweden has about twice the population of Norway, and yet Norway has a much bigger, ready military personnel, 25,000 in peacetime, 65,000 if a war happens. Sweden is more 15,000 in peacetime and 50,000 for war. Finland's is much, much larger. And so in joining NATO, I guess there is much more of an urgency. Norway has been prepared for a much longer time. And I suppose that's why that messaging comes through of the military and the government are already sort of handling this. We don't need to make the population panic. In Sweden, this is all going from we've never worried about this at all for hundreds of years. We really need to worry now.
Just finally then, on that question of urgency, which is basically what this episode is going to be about, and whether there is a sense of urgency percolating through to the west of Europe, is your sense of Norway and of the Scandinavian countries that urgency is there not just in government but among the public, that it has dawned on people have absorbed that there is a non-zero chance of a proper conflict involving Russia beyond Ukraine?
Increasingly so, but I think that it depends on where you are. I think in Finland, they've taken it seriously for a much longer period of time. In Sweden, they are ramping up that seriousness. In Norway, I think it's something that's slowly percolating out to the rest of the country. In the north, it's already very strong because they can feel it all the time with different types of hybrid attacks. In the south, it needs to ramp up quicker, but I think it is happening thanks to Ukraine. But there's still sort of a sense that despite us seeing this actually happen in Ukraine, there's still a feeling, at least from the people that I know, that surely it can't happen to us.
Gunnar Gronlid, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. We turn now to the military, and I'm joined by retired British General Sir Richard Shirreff, co-founder of Strategia Worldwide and former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Sir Richard, as you doubtless read this week, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, Chief of the Defence Staff here in the UK, was quoted as saying that the UK needs to learn from the Nordic and the Baltic countries and their attitude to national defence. Do you think he's right?
I am very glad to hear him saying something like that, because it makes a lot of sense. I'm a great admirer of Finland and Sweden, particularly. I know them both pretty well. And there is a huge amount we could learn. Both countries, particularly Finland, practice a doctrine of total defense, which means that the entire country is geared up in case of the worst case. And that's not just the armed forces, their reserves, their system of conscription, the fact that they've got absolutely top-end equipment and capabilities, and their training is pretty rigorous, but also industry, infrastructure, government, local government are also tied in and have to build their own resilience plans, and that plays through to the population as a whole. So yeah, but there's a heck of a long way to go before we're anywhere near there.
Well, I do want to talk a bit about how far we are from where Sir Tony and indeed yourself think we should be. But we did hear at the top of the show about these pamphlets that are being sent out to Finns, to Swedes, to Norwegians, and about the measures they are expected to take. And this is all part of that culture of total defence you're talking about. But what kind of imminent practical things could a government of any other European country do if they thought, OK, this is the road we need to go down?
Well, I think you start by doing a proper analysis of what is the threat and what is required to meet the threat. And I would also play into that analysis many of the experiences and lessons of the Cold War. Now, clearly, times have changed, but the civil defense organizations and the exercises that took place, and going back even further, some of the measures to ensure that people were properly prepared and properly protected, I think are also relevant here.
We also heard this week from Sweden's Civil Defence Minister, Carl-Oskar Bolin, and it tells us a fair bit that Sweden actually has a Civil Defence Minister, but they're talking about reviving an aspect of their conscription. This would be a civilian scheme that would train young people in crisis management. Is that maybe a line along which countries could think, even if they're still a bit nervous about the idea of full-scale military national service?
Well, I think, again, and I've gone on record saying this, it absolutely is time to think the unthinkable, both about military conscription and national service to meet the needs of the armed forces and defence, but on the assumption that you don't need every able-bodied male or indeed female school leaver for the defence force. Absolutely some form of national service to support the fabric of the nation, whether it's health services, or other aspects, I think is well worth thinking about and worth looking at.
Is this a point of view of yours that has changed in recent years? Because there is a conventional wisdom that professional militaries are usually a bit reticent about the idea of being opened up to, well, any old riffraff whose number comes up.
It absolutely has changed, Andrew. I mean, like any professional soldier, I certainly took the view, and to a certain extent do take the view, that conscription is anathema to the culture, the ethos of the British Armed Forces. And the Army in particular has always prided itself on its long service, non-commissioned officers, soldiers and officers. And it's not for nothing that we say that the Sergeant's Mess is the backbone of the British Army, because long service NCOs provide an extraordinary backbone. And what you don't want in that system is conscripts coming in for 5 minutes, training them up, and then sending them off back to university and civilian life. And so you've lost all that capability. But I've seen the way the Finns do it. I've, to a certain extent, the way the Norwegians do it and the Swedes. But the Finns, for example, can generate 200 top-of-the-range Leopard 2 tanks, the latest mark, in a matter of days using their reserve forces. Now, there's no way the British Army could do that. The Finns could generate an army of 280,000 at very short notice at readiness, again, because they can draw on the reserves. every young male Finn does national service, providing he's fit enough. Large numbers of females do it on a voluntary basis. And so that's what you get with national service. And it's not, I think we need to look at these things. So I've certainly changed my mind. I think we've got to look at it, because when I look at the British Army, I see an army that is struggling to meet its numbers, even though they are tiny in comparison with what is needed and what has gone before, dropping below 70,000 or so. I see recruiting that it can't generate the numbers required, and young people who are not really interested in joining. And so I think that we've got to look at other ways of doing it.
I mean, the impetus for this particular episode is considering the potential perfect storm gathering around Europe in terms of its defence, an increasingly agitated and volatile Russia, the possible expansion of Russia's war in Ukraine, the possibility that the United States might be about to become more isolationist. Absent US support, and thinking in terms of the obvious threat, which is Russia, how defendable actually is Europe if it has to defend itself?
It is entirely defendable, but it depends on moral courage and political leadership and a willingness to make the sacrifices required. Remember, in the G7 group of the richest nations in the world, there are 5 NATO members, excluding America: Italy, Germany, France, and Britain, and Canada as well. Well, these are the richest countries. If they can't dig deeper, then there's something badly wrong. And you've got to question, frankly, whether they should be in the G7. But at the moment, there isn't the political will. And why? Because there is not the political support. Because if you go outside your studio and talk to the man on the Baker Street omnibus right now, or a woman, she'll probably say she's more worried about the latest budget or the winter fuel allowances or something. If you go to Lithuania or Poland, I've just been in Lithuania, people are frightened. People know the Russians. They know what Russia did, or the Soviet Union did, to Lithuania, to Latvia, to Estonia in the time where they were where they were occupied and part of the Russian Empire. And rightly, they're damn frightened that it could happen again if Ukraine falls. So they are prepared to invest in defense. And what we've got to explain to the population in the UK is that our defense doesn't start on the White Cliffs of Dover or the Murray Firth. It starts in Lithuania and the forests there, or Poland, or Estonia, or Latvia. Because if they are engaged, we are all engaged. And so this is something that we should all be really concerned about, and therefore be prepared to do what needs to be done. And with the right leadership, Europe could defend itself. But it's going to take time. This is not going to happen overnight. And we've got to start now. We should have started years ago.
All that taken into consideration, and with due acknowledgement that military preparedness and readiness is not just about bulk tonnage, is this week a weird time for the UK to be announcing that it's scrapping 5 warships among various other kit, as Defence Secretary John Healey has announced?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that. I mean, on the face of it, I see the Times, for example, is leaping up and down with all sorts of protests. When I went through the list in the paper this morning of what's been cut, to be honest, it seemed to me to be, in a way, sensible housekeeping, because, these are 50-year-old helicopters. This is the Watchkeeper drone, which has drone technology since 2010 has put it completely in the dark ages. So it might just be, and you've got ships that are being axed, which have been tied up, unable to work, and got massive, deep maintenance and structural problems. Now, the quid pro quo is, if you're getting rid of stuff like this, what's following on? Now, there is a defense review in place, as you know. I've got great confidence in that review, largely because it's led by George Robertson, who was the Secretary of State for Defense when I went through the defense review that he led in 97, 98. And that was properly done. The difference between now and 97, 98 is the fiscal position is that much more dire. But I think as long as the defense, what we've got to hope for is that this defense review comes up with a structure of our armed forces that is really focused and fit to fight the wars that are most likely to hit us, which is a land war in Europe.
And just finally on that prospect, and this is something that obviously you have been warning about for quite a way longer than a lot of people grasped that this was a possibility. If you think back in developments in Ukraine over the last 6 months, are you more or less concerned than you might have been about the prospect of that war spreading?
Yeah, more concerned, no question. Ukraine's on the back foot. Russia's got the strategic initiative. Yeah, and they are, for all that it's brutal, they're losing scores, throwing away tens and thousands of Russian lives in the process with their meat attacks. But incrementally, yard by yard, they are gaining. And by that, the fact that they can outgun and outmatch Ukraine at the moment, things do not look good for Ukraine, unless and until we in NATO and the West wake up to the fact that the only way this war is going to stop is for Ukraine to defeat Russia in Ukraine. And that is going to require a fundamental mindset shift. My concern, of course, is that with the Trump regime about to take command in the United States, Mr. Trump has promised he's going to end the war in that afternoon. He's a mate of Putin. And if he does it on Putin's terms, that sets the scene for Russia to rearm, rebuild, have another go when they're ready. It frankly sets the scene for a long-running, continued attritional war in Ukraine, because I don't think the Ukrainians would accept anything that meets Trump's terms. And ultimately, Putin will have another go at Ukraine. And when he's done that and achieved his aim of annexing the East, reducing the rest of it to a rump state dependent and a vassal state on Russia, make no mistake, he'll have another go somewhere else, like the Baltic states.
That was General Sir Richard Shirreff, co-founder of Strategia Worldwide and former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. And finally, how prepared are Europe's leaders? Well, joining me is the American-German political scientist Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, former director and CEO at the German Council on Foreign Relations and co-founder of Harvard's The Future of Diplomacy project. Cathryn, Europe can't say it wasn't warned. Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. The US elected Donald Trump in 2016. We all know what happened in 2022. But in those corridors of power at the top echelons of European governments, has anything meaningfully changed?
No. In the sense that, you're absolutely right. Not only were many of these changes, not only, of course, the invasion of Crimea, which we could all read out of the intelligence briefings from the Americans, and I think you and I were probably both at that Munich Security Conference where Kamala Harris briefed all the European leaders on what was to come. That's one thing, and that sort of overemphasizes the continuing dependence, by the way, which Europeans have on American intelligence, which now, under Tulsi Gabbard, will likely be instrumentalized, like much of the weapons, quote unquote, in Donald Trump's diplomatic and kinetic arsenal. But now also with this shift in a U.S. administration very clearly, because while he might not end up having a full popular vote mandate, by the way, as we talk, it's about 1.8% difference, but nonetheless, a Senate majority, something that looks like stability in the House. And then, of course, we have all the plans in writing. We learned a few hours ago that one of the key architects of Project 2025 is going back to the Office of Management and Budget. And so that seems to indicate that for all the denial that came across the Atlantic when it came to Project 2025, which many of us were reading and hopefully leaders were reading in the same way and potentially using to prepare, they didn't take that seriously enough, despite the fact that after 2016, we said Donald Trump needs to be taken literally and seriously. And again, this time it seems that bar what the preparation was at the EU Commission after the European election, national capitals haven't done enough of their homework.
What does happen, though, if Donald Trump proves in his second term to be even more determinedly isolationist than he was in his first? Does Europe have an obvious default leader? I mean, one might think the president of France, because that is the last country left, which is a member of the EU, a member of NATO, and a nuclear-armed permanent 5 on the Security Council power. So does it devolve to Paris to lead Europe?
I mean, I think for Emmanuel Macron's ego, that could feel good. You remember that in the last go around with Donald Trump, he said, look, what this man needs to understand my own power is a nice military parade. But it ultimately didn't seem to help much in the relations between the United States and France, nor in the relationships between the United States and Europe. But it's true in some regard, despite the fact that he has an absolutely weakened and somewhat dysfunctional government beneath him that is frankly only staring now at a 2027 presidential election to try to move him off the political reservation. He is, at least for the moment, at least, the last man standing with respect to the large powers in Europe. Because the Germans, even after this election in February, likely won't have a coalition agreement until April. So any government under whichever chancellor it may be won't get started in having serious negotiation power, if any, or prowess with Washington and other powers until the spring. Leaves one other figure in the interlocution, which between Washington and continental Europe is going to be increasingly viable, is Donald Tusk and the Poles. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at some of the dynamics that we saw at the end of the Trump administration, I think these are major questions early in the Trump administration, keeping conventional U.S. forces on the ground in Europe. They are likely to move out of Germany, not because that makes any defensive sense, not because that makes any strategic sense, not because that even makes any economic efficiency sense, but just because Donald Trump has it out for Germany, continues to have it out for Germany, for Germany's erstwhile economic success, because clearly it doesn't have that anymore. And in that sense, it's still retribution time. And in that moment, this is something that truly the Europeans could have prepared for, which is to say, make Donald Tusk, when it comes to these issues, as the French would say, the porte-parole, the speaker of Europe, to try to convince a Trump administration to keep conventional forces in Europe, however they are structured, move them to Poland, make Poland in that sense a stronger base, and have his voice speak louder, clearer, and potentially more radically to a Trump administration. I think that's something that Donald Trump could respect, even despite the fact that Donald Tusk has been highly critical in advance of some of the moves that the Republicans held up, a lot of the Ukraine aid, the Israel aid. You remember there was a famous tweet by Donald Tusk. That didn't sit well with the Polish leader, but I still think he's in a much better position, frankly, to go toe-to-toe with a Trump administration than, frankly, any of the other two larger powers that we were just discussing.
I mean, the Poles have obviously taken this whole thing incredibly seriously, which is a function of their history and their geography, and the same is true for all of Eastern Europe. But just before you said Poland, I was vaguely wondering if you were about to say the United Kingdom, which is, of course, also a nuclear-armed permanent five-member on the UN Security Council. But has the fact of Brexit been interpreted still by the rest of Europe as a declaration by the UK that it just is not interested in having that sort of leadership role?
Well, I think you've seen early moves by Keir Starmer and his government to really reinforce the European political community, to sign this agreement with Germany, to put at least the UK back in the conversation, particularly on all of the defense questions, but to look more critically at a number of areas in which, frankly, the UK and the continent need to be working closer together. It sort of stands in the offing whether we could be reopening some of the more difficult negotiations we had over the last year and a half, but it remains a lot of bad blood, frankly, and bad history from those negotiations, from what I hear from the negotiation circles. And nonetheless, Keir Starmer seems to be signaling that he is a person who could try to hold a triangle, United States, continental Europe, and the UK together. That's at least how he's going to position himself. That's the only thing that makes sense, in part because he has the strong defense architecture, he has defense production capability, which in some respects is lacking on the continent, or there needs to be arrangements made for that to ramp up some of those capacities. So there's room to maneuver, but of course he has other important stakes that are now more vital for the UK as well. So that still remains a triangular situation. He'll be looking to see as well, also with a difficult economic background, how to position the UK in what will be a difficult situation, because very clearly It's right there on page 188 of Project 2025. The main mission of the Trump administration is to pick Europe apart and to look for new allies within the European Union. And there they've got their sights set squarely on some of the Eastern European member states.
Is the problem fundamentally that if you look at the current coterie of European leaders, that none of them really want the job of leading Europe or of being the person out in front of this, either because they're not keen on the risks, they're not keen on the responsibilities, or they don't think they can sell it to their electorates, because electorates, of course, are never keen to hear bad news, especially when it doesn't seem to be, at least not yet, affecting them directly?
Well, I think there's one person who would very much like to continue to be the leader of Europe, quote, in quote, and that's the Hungarian Premier Viktor Orban, who quite enjoyed the self-perceived role of diplomat-in-chief without any diplomatic charge. Every time Viktor Orban went out as part of the Hungarian rotating presidency of the Council, both Brussels and the rest of Europe seemed to shudder because there was no sequencing, there was no coordination, and he truly did not speak for Europe, but he might like that role, frankly, because he sees himself in that sort of similar imperialistic garb as Donald Trump or other autocrats might see themselves at this moment. But it's true. I think that the fundamental piece is that many of the large European countries are focused so much on their own economic and political challenges at this moment. So you've accurately described what's going on. And you're also right in saying that we're not seeing clear leadership that could move all of Europe forward in a way that is sort of unfettered from the domestic circumstance, even in Poland, where this government is still very much trying to roll back some of the changes put in place by the PiS government before. And even though Duda is on his way out, he's still really, holding some parts of that ringed circus. So everywhere you look, Europe is preoccupied with itself, with its economic calamities, with its security calamities, and that does not spell global leadership in a moment when both the United States and China will try to take slices out of that European pie.
Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris Chermak at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.